Get them down here. Good morning. About 50 years ago, as I graduated from college, 50, a friend told me that after hundreds of hours in laboratories and in libraries and in classrooms, she had developed 3 really strong theories of child development, and she was really convinced of these 3 theories, as you can be when you're fresh out of college. So she really thought she understood child development, and then she moved to the East Coast. She and I didn't see each other. Recently, she returned to Minneapolis, St. Paul, where our family lives. She told me that she's now married, she has 3 children, and she has no theories of child development. I'm not going to talk a lot about theories today, but I am going to say thank you to the people in the room, and thank you to the panel. I hope a few of you can stick around because some of what's going to happen in the next 20 minutes is a direct response to what you've just described. I hope that you would be willing to help an old man, which is me. There's been a lot of discussion about audience participation, and we're going to take that in a different way. So I'm going to introduce a song, and given that about 5 people raised their hands yesterday when somebody asked, did you see the moonwalk, which was 50 years ago, I thought, wow, I am older than I thought, and I'm 71, and I thought, anyway, so we're going to have a new level of audience participation. It's called singing. And those of you who remember the civil rights movement, some of you were active in it, you know the very important role of singing in the civil rights movement. So with Mark's help, we're going to start. Okay, Mark, we're going to hear this once and then we'll try it.
I know the one thing we did right was the day we started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
Great. Okay, so we're going to try one round of that. The words are, keep your eyes, I know that was a little loud, I'm sorry. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. That was one of the things that we sang as we walked down the streets in Montgomery, or we walked down the streets in Jackson, or we prepared to sit in. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. So let's try that. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on. All right, let's try one more time, and we'll come back. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on. Okay, we're going to talk about what the prize is. The prize is not a lot more charter schools in the United States. That wouldn't be bad, necessarily. But the prize is having a lot more fulfilled young people who have reached their potential, who understand the possibilities. So I want to ask questions not only for chartered public schools, but for all public schools. Because for many of us, this is about a life's mission to help transform people's lives. It's not just about chartering, that's a strategy toward a larger goal. But let's start with the history of our movement, because many of you have heard that the charter movement is really about an attempt to destroy public education. So we need to start with the first person who mentioned the idea of having public schools outside the control of local districts. It wasn't Al Shanker, it wasn't other people writing in the 1980s. It was a man named Dr. Kenneth Clark. And Dr. Kenneth Clark was the co-author of the Dahl test used in the Brown versus Board of Education. And many of you are familiar with the Dahl test. Can somebody tell us briefly what the Dahl test was? Yes, ma'am.
As I understand it, the Dahl test is they showed children, maybe 5 or 6, a white doll and a black doll. And they asked them which one was prettier or which one would they like to have. And every single child selected the white doll.
And that, to our shame, those of us who are whites, to our shame, that was a really good explanation. Thank you very much. And it was his study, along with his wife's study, that helped lead to Brown versus Board of Education. Well, Dr. Kenneth Clark was a huge advocate of equity, a word that we heard in this last panel, and a demander and a fighter for equity. So what happened? Well, over the next 20 years, between Brown and 1968, Dr. Kenneth Clark got so upset with district public schools controlled by local boards that he wrote the following in the Harvard Ed Review. And by the way, this is a part of your app. Thanks to Steve and his colleagues for putting all of this, Edward and others for putting all of this in the app. But I also have 50 copies, thanks to the coalition, 50 copies of this. This is in the Harvard Ed Review, 1968. Alternatives, realistic, aggressive, viable competitors to the present public school systems must be found. Alternatives must be found, 1968. The development of such competitive public school systems will be attacked by the defenders of the present system as attempts to weaken the present system, and therefore weaken, if not destroy, public education. Have you heard that one before? Oh, you're in charter world, you're trying to destroy public education. Kenneth Clark is saying, 1968, he's predicting that's what some folks are going to say, and he says, this type of expected self-serving argument can be briefly and accurately disposed of by asserting and demonstrating that truly effective competition strengthens rather than weakens that which deserves to survive. 1968. The charter idea, folks, was not Al Shanker's idea. In fact, what Al Shanker was talking about was alternatives within districts, which is not a bad idea either. But let's be clear about our history. And let's be clear about people like Rosa Parks. Yes, that Rosa Parks. In the last 5 years of her remarkable sainted life, Rosa Parks tried to start a chartered public school in Detroit and was turned down by the local board. So one of the questions that I'm going to ask you to consider is this fall, would you please briefly discuss with the faculty and the families and the parents and the students the heritage of chartered public schools? It is Rosa Parks, it is Kenneth Clark, and we need to know our history because as was described in a wonderful series of TV shows some years ago referring to Black history, the history of chartering has been lost, stolen, and strayed. Let's be clear about where we're coming from. We're coming from people like Kenneth Clark. We're coming from people like Rosa Parks. Would you agree that's a good place to be coming from? So for some of us, chartering is not an interesting idea that may or may not be a good thing. We could go back to the Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations, 1948. That was not a conservative document. It wasn't dreamed up, with all due respect, by Donald Trump or people associated with that worldview. It was Eleanor Roosevelt and other people. And in Article 19, we read, the fundamental principle of a parent's right to choose the school should be paramount. Article 19, United Nations Declaration of Human Rights for the whole world, not just the United States. That's part of our heritage too. And we need to understand that. And we need to share that because, as I said, our history is being lost, stolen, and it's getting strayed. Other words as well. So one of the things that we do in Minnesota is that we have an annual charter school writing contest, and hundreds of people come to the state capitol, and young people at various ages read their essays. And this is a young man reading an essay to the chair of the Senate Higher Education Committee. We have to be aggressive in outreach. You just described a dilemma that is outrageous, where a school that appears to be highly successful with the very people who are the most at need of public education are being messed over by legislators, some of whom may not understand what they're up to. We cannot be satisfied to do a good job in the schools. This is one of the mistakes that a number of us made in the 60s and 70s with alternative schools. Many of the alternative schools, not all, but many of the alternative schools, like a K through 12 school in which I work, created by a group of mothers in St. Paul, Minnesota, Many of them did a wonderful job, but they were attacked by people in colleges of education. They were attacked by legislators. Our school, K through 12 school in St. Paul, a district school, was only approved on a 4-3 vote despite a massive effort to community organize. It took 5 mothers and then a group of people that they organized that grew to 2,000 to get that school open, and the school is still alive in 2019, so you can do the math. Started in 1971, it's around. But from the very beginning, we understood it was not enough to do a good job with kids. We have to keep our eyes on the prize, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So for me, chartering is 3 fundamental things. I didn't say chartered public schools, I said chartering. Chartering is about as basic a principle as there is in America. Chartering is first a principle that says that we ought to be able to create new products, services, programs, opportunities. Number 1, we ought to be able to create new programs, new approaches, as long as number 2, we are willing to accept responsibility for results, and as long as we are going to operate within some limits. That's the chartering idea. Now, it's a little bit like freedom of speech. Does everybody use freedom of speech? Well, of course not. Does everybody use the freedom of assembly? Well, of course not. Does that mean that the freedom of speech or the freedom of assembly are bad ideas? No. But we have to help people understand that the chartering idea is fundamentally an American idea, not a Democratic idea, not a Republican idea. It is an idea of giving people a chance to create something new as long as we're willing to be responsible for results and we are willing to operate within some limits. And those are fundamental principles which all too often get lost in people talking about privatizing or destroying public education, whatever. We need to be clear about that because I can assure you that in every state where this idea is being discussed, in every state where brave people such as yourselves are creating new options, either within the districts or in chartering, they're being attacked. There was one thing that I agreed with Al Shanker about very strongly. In 1988, Al Shanker, then president of the American Federation of Teachers, talked about people who in district schools were trying to create new options. And what did he say? He said, and I'm quoting directly, people who try to create new options in public education are treated like traitors or outlaws for daring to move outside the lockstep. Have any of you ever been treated like a traitor or an outlaw? Yeah. So we need to be clear that the system, as the panel said, needs to create new incentives to encourage, to support, to promote the kind of school that you've just described, to encourage, to promote the kind of school that LA that's now battling. The chair of the board is battling to make sure that that school continues, even though the students say it's a terrific place. The bad news is that doing well with students makes some people even angrier with you. Can you imagine that? Doing well with students makes some people even angrier with you. Okay. Now, one of the fundamental things that we need to talk about, and there was a wonderful panel with students yesterday who pleaded for us to help with this, and I'll say more about this, is to recognize that young people need to learn as a part of coursework right now, whether they're 5 or 12 or 18, they can make a difference in the world. And you heard from Tony Simmons on the first night. Those of you who are here, he's executive director of the High School for Recording Arts in St. Paul. This is the founder in the center, right here. This is the founder in the center of the High School for Recording Arts. And you might recognize somebody else who has a bit longer hair more than 40 years ago than he does today. This is a class that David was in called Protect Your Rights and Money, where we solved real problems that adults refer to them. And the kids learned about reading contracts and understanding contracts. They learned about all kinds of critical things to protect themselves. They also worked on these cases. They didn't just read about them, they worked on them. And by the way, this was part of the graduation process, to learn how to make a difference in the world now. Students had to demonstrate they could do something to make a better community. That was a graduation requirement. And we gave kids credit. We didn't use the absurd Carnegie system of graduation. I'll be talking after this presentation in a smaller group up here for anybody who wants to talk about the crazy Carnegie system. But the Carnegie graduation system, so many credits of this, so many credits of that, goes back more than 100 years to a time when Carnegie, a very wealthy guy, was trying to give money to increase the status of college professors. And so they figured out what was an institution they could give money to. They decided to do that. Then they tried to figure out what was a college. They decided an average college required for admission 16 units of 120 hours. And that's how they got into college. Now, what does that have to do with learning and teaching and schooling? Nothing. But that's the fundamental system of graduation in virtually every state. The Carnegie unit. Can we do better? Of course. We can have graduation, for example, based on skill and knowledge. We can have graduation based on demonstration of, for example, the ability to make a difference in the world. This young man, David, in the center, as you can see, is wearing a hat. We really didn't care whether he wore a hat or not. He'd been kicked out of his previous school because he was walking down the hall one day. A teacher told him to get his hat off his head. He refused. The teacher said, well, you know there's a rule, get it off your head. David said something, he shouldn't have said something stupid like, get off my case, and had a few other words in there. So David kept walking, and the teacher walked up to David and said, don't sass me, and knocked the hat off David's head, at which point David knocked the teacher on the floor, which he shouldn't have done. He was kicked out of that district school, sent to our district school, K through 12 option, and we didn't care if he wore a hat. What we did care about was that he was 15 years old and he could barely read. And there was no really good reason for him to learn to read other than he was angry, alienated, and he hated school. So we got him involved in efforts to help make a difference in the world. And one of the projects was a class where it was a case where a radio had supposed to be in a car radio in a car, and they had messed that up, and long story. But anyway, the kids talked about what we might do. Some kids said, well, let's contact the dealer. Some kids said, let's call the Better Business Bureau. David knew he was supposed to write something down. So he said, well, let's write down the problem, wrap it around a brick, and throw it through the window of the dealership. That probably wouldn't have solved the problem. Probably would have created more problems. Anyway, David and other kids figured out how to actually solve that problem. This was a picture that appeared in the local newspaper. David said to me, Joe, I often thought I might have my name in the paper. I even thought I might have my picture in the paper, but I never thought it would be for something good. So David graduated, went to work for Prince, was a terrific record producer, and as Tony said, decided with Tony's help and with some other people's help to create a chartered public school where now hundreds of young people who are just like David, angry, alienated, furious, frustrated, are seeing that they can make a difference in the world. And one of them has more than 2 million hits on her Facebook site, and she's just earned $100,000, and she's 17 years old because of her massive skills in singing. So we ought to be helping young people learn that they can make a difference in the world now. And for those of you interested in this idea, there's a wonderful website, www.whatkidscando.org. www.whatkidscando.org. Now, just yesterday afternoon, thanks to Steve and his colleagues, there was a panel of youngsters that pleaded with us. I mean to use the word pleaded, urged, recommended, whatever strong verb you want to use, to make learning in the community and constructive action in the community part of graduation requirements. Don't discourage, encourage it. Some of the schools, like Amy Beale, for example, were decided as places where this kind of thing is encouraged. So, excuse me. Schools were cited as places that became far more difficult. What are we doing in these schools, in your schools, in our schools, district or chartered, to encourage this kind of activity? The young people have some ideas, and in fact, some of them will be talking about it this afternoon. This leads to every youngster, whether district or charter, having a plan for what she or he is going to do over the year that builds on and develops their skills, talents, and interests. One of the reasons that the district school that I mentioned is still around after more than 40 years is that every year the school starts off with an individual parent, teacher, family student conference before school starts. So the very first conversation between the home and the school, or between the youngster and the school, is a positive one, which for many youngsters is a big change. The first call from home to home in many cases for youngsters is, your kid did this terrible thing, what are you going to do about it? This completely reverses that, makes the first contact between home and school a positive one. We heard from your secretary and from the distinguished state representatives the importance of hearing about multiple measures. We actually have a report on our website called What Should We Do that describes multiple measures from district and chartered public schools. I want to thank Steve and Edward and others from the coalition who earlier this year featured a presentation that included Deborah Meyer and some other people from the district world and charters working together to describe very specific examples of applied performance assessment. We can, we should, we must use a broader array of measures. You heard from the head of NACSA yesterday talking about the importance of this. He's certainly encouraged it. NACSA has encouraged it. We have very specific, very practical examples. If you go on the coalition website, you can see the webinar. We need to be using a wider array of measures to help document the changes. And by the way, to say, here are some areas where we need to do better. One of the best ideas that's come along in a long time, that was pioneered by, among others, the school that I've mentioned, is to allow high school kids to earn free college credit. I'm not just talking about AP and IB. In Minnesota and some other states, youngsters are actually allowed to take courses on college campuses while they're high school juniors and seniors and freshmen. This is one of the greatest gifts we can give young people, is to help them, particularly young people who would be the first in their family, help young people to see that they can actually earn college credit while they're in high school. It's a transformative experience for many young people who would be the first in their family to have ever gone to college. It was mentioned, Steve mentioned that one of the things that we're doing is a creative district charter, city, county, statewide coalition to battle homelessness. One of the things I want to encourage you to do, and many of you are already doing it, is to identify one big issue that faces students and families, and to reach out to other organizations and make that a part of your curriculum. In this case, several charters and several districts have said we're going to attack homelessness in Minnesota, and this is one of the products. A meeting with the Attorney General, who's in the center of the picture and has a white shirt and a tie. Someone I showed this to the other day said, oh, that's the distinguished young man sitting in the first row. Actually, he looks like he might be an Attorney General, but he's not. The Attorney General in Minnesota is in the middle of the picture. He's African American. He's a parent of a youngster who went to a chartered public school. His name is Keith Ellison, and he was so impressed with the youngsters, some of whom were from chartered public schools, that he decided to do a statewide podcast. This coalition has helped lead to $1 million more being devoted to this, and is working this Thursday, 2 days from now, with a broad group of people to talk about what's going to happen at the legislature next year. So we need to look outside our schools. We can make the part of the curriculum things that are happening in the world today with kids, and as they will say this afternoon, it's something many of them want. Many of them will learn an enormous amount. The young people in that picture had never been in the state capitol before. A month ago, they were in the state capitol for the first time, not to walk around and look at the statues and the pictures and say, ooh, gee, or be bored. They were in there to talk with the Attorney General about what to do to help reduce homelessness. So here are some key questions. Are you helping students, families, and staff understand the history and the true chartering idea? Are you inviting community leaders to visit? As was suggested, are you bringing kids to see community leaders? Are you helping young people learn to create a better community? Are you helping young people, every young person, to develop an individual plan? Are you using multiple measures to assess and share and improve your work? And are you partnering with others? Because the prize is not just more chartered public schools. The prize, I suspect, for every person in this room is a country that has more opportunity, more justice. The prize is not just more chartered public schools. The prize is fundamentally justice, opportunity, and equity. So, I ask that you help. In the beginning, I'm going to ask that you help again. We don't have the music right now, but let's try it one more time. This is another part of the song, and I'll do it once, and my voice is not great, so I hope you'll help me the second time. The only thing that we did wrong was stay in the wilderness too long. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Okay, can we do that together? The only thing that we did wrong was stay in the wilderness too long. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on. Let's do this one together. And many of you got the music, which is great. The only thing that we did right was the day we began to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Thank you.